our third step, tubular secretion, yes, is reabsorption in reverse. Instead of pulling everything out of the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, or the collecting duct, we are now going to put stuff into those particular regions. Now, all the different parts, if I can draw. Now, most of secretion happens in the proximal convoluted tubule. Knew as soon as I'd start, he'd come. All right, back to tubular secretion. Now, as most things left, lots and lots of things were reabsorbed out of the proximal convoluted tubule. We kept them. Yes, usually the reabsorption that happens in the proximal convoluted tubule all happens because of diffusion. It's just going from high to low. Really concentrated in here, not concentrated outside. Things will leave. We ended last time talking about all the reabsorption that happens in the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule. Those were all hormonal-based reabsorption. So there were different hormones that says, yes, let's reabsorb water, or reabsorb more sodium, or, and I'm like, put in some of the reabsorbed potassium. Now, most of your secretion is going to happen in your proximal convoluted tubule. So this little part right after filtration, right after the Bowman's capsule, is a very busy place. Lots of reabsorption, lots of secretion happening. Now, yes, almost all secretion happens in the proximal convoluted tubule, and it's selected substances that are going to go in there. It's not just anything and everything is going to get secreted and end up as in urine. Things that will leave some of those peritubular capillaries and go in, potassium, hydrogen ions, ammonium, creatine, organic acids, bases, they all can go from the blood supply around and into the tubes, and it will eventually leave as the urine with the filtrate. Now, disposal of substances like drugs can be sometimes a little trickier. Drugs are usually bound to some type of protein, and it's the protein. The protein gets secreted, and the drug that's attached to it. There's my drug attached to a protein. Very nice. We'll go with it. Now, not all drugs can be secreted through the urine, and sometimes they get secreted, they can leave with the urine, other times they go in and they just get reabsorbed right back. But the fact that we can attach certain substances to proteins, then we can actually get it into the secretion to leave the body. And so we can get rid of undesirable substances. We can also, using secretion, get rid of excessive potassium ions. The hormone aldosterone helped with that. As we reabsorb sodium out, potassium went in. We can also secrete hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, our hydrogen and hydroxide ions, into the urine to help regulate our blood pH. What does your blood pH? What is the range? Very narrow range. If it starts to become too acidic, if it's like 7.25, that can do damage to organs. We can secrete hydrogen ions into our urine, because the more hydrogen ions, the more acidic something is. If those hydrogen ions leave the body, your pH rises. Same thing, if it starts to become too high, if it starts to get closer to, the 7.55, it's too basic or too alkaline, we can secrete some of those bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate ions are alkaline. If we get rid of them, we will lower our pH and become more acidic. So our urinary system is one of the big things that helps regulate pH. Yes, our breathing could also help regulate pH, the carbon dioxide and carbonic acid, but our urinary system is very much a large one that regulates our pH. Now, in your book, figure 25.15 does a summary of last time and this time, reabsorption and secretion and where it all happens. So everything in blue is reabsorption. So this is stuff we talked about last time. We reabsorb a lot of water. In our proximal convoluted tubule, tons of stuff get reabsorbed. It's a very busy area. So lots of reabsorption. When we start getting into our distal convoluted and our collecting duct, lots of hormones that are regulating reabsorption. And then everything in the green is all secretion. Again, some hormone things. We can get rid of urea. We can get rid of certain ions. We can get rid of certain drugs. Most will get secreted into the proximal excuse me, convoluted tubule. You start getting into some of the hormone things at the end. So with everything getting reabsorbed, everything getting secreted, it's all to also, help maintain what's called our urine osmolality. That's the MOSM. It's for milliosmoles. It's really how concentrated is your urine. How much water compared to how many ions are we actually getting rid of. So we're usually trying to keep our concentration of our urine a little over 300 milliosmoles. That can change, though, depending on what you eat and what you drink. If you are overhydrated, means you are just drinking water nonstop, never ending, you have lots and lots of water in your body, you're going to end up having a large volume of very dilute urine. I'm like, we want to get rid of all that excess water. Your antidiuretic hormone production is going to decrease, because what's the antidiuretic hormone known as? But what's it known as? It's got a nickname. Your antidiuretic hormone? Anti-pee. Well, we now want to pee, so that antidiuretic, your anti-pee production is going to go down. So you're going to urinate a lot. And your urine is going to have a lower concentration of solutes in it. It's going to be a more dilute urine. If you have another hormone called aldosterone, more ions get reabsorbed, and your urine is even less concentrated. This is when you're drinking lots and lots of water, you're going to have a very clear urine. It's not very concentrated. You might be between that 50 and 100 milliosmoles. Very, very dilute. If you are dehydrated, opposite side, you're going to have very little bit of urine, and it's going to be very, very concentrated. Again, our body wants to try to, if you're not drinking a lot of water, our body wants to conserve that water. And so you're going to release that antidiuretic hormone so that you don't pee. Otherwise, you're peeing away all that water, and you're already dehydrated. And your urine is going to end up extremely concentrated. It'll have a concentration of around, 1,200, meaning it's going to be really dark yellow. Because it's lots and lots of ions, lots and lots of different types of solutions, urea, uric acid, all put in there. When you're severely dehydrated, but 99% of all of your water gets reabsorbed, and you end up making very little urine. Now, and I'm like, people that do lots of running, lots of exercising, they usually, sometimes you don't always know if you're hydrated enough. They always just say, look at your urine. If it's a light colored, you're hydrated. If it's a dark yellow, you are dehydrated. Drink more water. So you can kind of tell. Now, urea is one of the solutions that we reabsorb and secrete. And so, since we're doing both, it has a recycling effect. So, and I'm like, and part of that is, I was going to say, my saying, what follows solutes? Water follows solutes, whatever they are. Water will follow urea. It's one of the solutes. And so what ends up happening, we will secrete urine in our ascending limb of our nephron loop, or loop of Henle, by facilitated diffusion. We've got proteins that are pumping it in there. And then what will follow is water. Water will follow the urea. Now, eventually as we go, and I'm like through our distal convoluted tubule and our collecting duct, we are going to start to reabsorb water out. We're going to still concentrate more water. I should have kept more of this on here, but I ran out of room. We're going to absorb more water out. That can be over here. So we first put a lot of urea in. We have lots of urea, and water will follow. Blue is my water. Water will follow. Now, as we travel, the water all gets reabsorbed out. So what does that do to the concentration of the urea? By the time we went here, If all the water gets reabsorbed out, what does that do to the concentration of the urea that's in here? It increases. All of a sudden you have lots of urea and not a lot of water. Now, does urea like to be concentrated? No. And so it will leave by diffusion, and it ends up leaving, and eventually it goes all the way back over to right here. Water will follow. It's one of those, it's called urea recycling. Urea is constantly going in, bringing water in. Water gets absorbed. And I'm like, you end up with lots of urea. It leaves. And so, yes, some of it will leave with urine, but not a lot of it. And I'm like, it just keeps getting recycled. However, it does help with pulling water in and help with filtering out our blood. So it's just moving of urea around. Now, a diuretic. These are things that enhance urinary output, meaning we now want to pee. Any type of diuretic. Anti-diuretic inhibitors. An anti-diuretic is anti-pee. Well, now we want to pee, so we have an anti-diuretic inhibitor. We talked about it last time. Alcohol is an anti-diuretic inhibitor, which means it would now enhance urinary output, and you have to urinate all the time. Sodium reabsorption inhibitors, because when you reabsorb sodium, what follows? Water, and water would follow. Well, we want to stop that. So we have sodium reabsorption inhibitors. Examples of sodium reabsorption inhibitors: caffeine, certain drugs for hypertension, or edema. Edema just means now you have fluid in interstitial spaces. Like if you have too much fluid, we want to be able to get rid of that excessive fluid. So we can use some type of drug that's a sodium reabsorption inhibitor. If you don't absorb the sodium, you don't absorb the water, and it leaves with your urine. Now, osmotic diuretics. These are just substances that are not reabsorbed. So water remains in the urine. Examples of an osmotic diuretic, I briefly talked about this last time too, is if you have high glucose in a diabetic patient. This is just getting really messy. If you have lots of glucose, most of your glucose should get reabsorbed out in your proximal convoluted tubule. But if all of your channels are completely full, and now you have glucose in here that's still in your filtrate, if glucose is here, what wants to join it? Water will. Water follows solutes. And I'm like, and so if you have excessive glucose in your urine, it causes what's known as an osmotic diuretic. And I'm like, that particular substance will pull water into the urine, and now you're going to be urinating excessively. Again, one of the key indications of someone that has diabetes that's going unchecked. They get too much sugar in their blood, can't reabsorb it all, and so you end up with sugar in their filtrates, which will pull water in with it. So they urinate a lot, and it's sugary. Now, edema, because I added this slide in. I'm like, I kind of briefly touched on it that, yes, it's fluid in interstitial spaces. It just means you have an accumulation of fluid in your, in your interstitial fluid, or accumulation of interstitial fluid. It just means you have fluid in your tissue around the cells. This is what will make you swell. I'm like, you just have too much fluid. That means you've got too much fluid that's leaving the blood, or too much fluid, or not enough fluid is going to go into the blood. Like you just have too much fluid around into your tissues. This is not always good. A lot of times it can happen, one, if you have eating too much salt, makes you retain water. That's edema. You have too much fluid in your tissues. After certain surgeries, certain areas can swell up. You have too much fluid in your tissues. Now, if you have too much fluid in your tissues, that fluid is no longer in your blood supply, and that can actually result in a low blood pressure that could actually impact your circulation. The blood can't get everywhere it needs to go. All that fluid should be in your blood. Your blood's mostly water, but instead it's in all of this tissue instead. And so they're usually going to give you some type of diuretic to try to get some of that fluid back in and out, back into the urine and out, or into our blood supply. Now, renal clearance. This is talking about how much we can, get out of our body. I'm going to erase this. It's just messy. How much stuff we can get out of our body in our nephron. Hence the word clear, is we want to get something out of our body. It's getting sloppier as I do this. Still kind of looks like it. Now, your kidneys can clear any particular substance at a particular rate. So there's, sugar has its own rate of clearance. We can clear X number, I don't know if I've got it on a slide somewhere, X number amount of glucose per volume of filtrate per minute. And I'm like, same thing, I'm like, our kidneys can clear the sodium out of our body X amount in X amount of fluid in X amount of time. So how much can we get out of our body? How much can we get rid of? That's renal clearance. Now, we can look to see, can our bodies get rid of certain substances in a certain amount of time to see if our kidneys are actually working correctly. If we're not getting rid of it out of the body, that means it's staying in the body. It means it's not getting filtered correctly. It's not getting reabsorbed. It's not getting secreted correctly. Something's happening with our kidneys. So we can determine our glomerular filtration rate. That's what the GFR says. Glomerular filtration rate. Are our kidneys working? Are we filtering the blood? Are we getting rid of things that are in the blood? Where is it all going? So we can look to see, is there any damage to our kidneys? One, if it's in the glomerulus itself, or if it's further damage in our kidneys as well. And we can look to see what's happening in our kidneys. Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Is it just kind of a fluke that happened, that we couldn't get rid of some type of substance? Now, we always compare it, renal clearance, to a specific molecule called inulin. It's a plant polysaccharide. It's like a starch. Now, we know that inulin, this plant polysaccharide, is freely filtered. It can go through the glomerulus and get filtered, just go straight through the filtration to get filtered. We don't reabsorb it. We don't secrete it. So whatever's in your blood supply is going to get filtered and leave. Now, we know that the renal clearance for this particular plant substance is we can clear 125 milliliters of this particular substance every single minute. So we know, if you've got healthy working kidneys, everything's getting filtered, there's no damage to your glomerulus, we can filter this particular plant polysaccharide that much. Now, if the clearance is less than that 125, that means some type of substance gets reabsorbed. So if we're comparing it to some other type of substance, whether it's sugar or whether it's another type of drug, I'm like, if the clearance is less than 125, something's getting reabsorbed, so it doesn't end up in your urine. If we say that the clearance is 0, it just means the substance is completely reabsorbed or was never filtered to begin with, which means you don't have any of it in your urine. Either it didn't get filtered and it stayed in the blood, or you reabsorbed all of it. If we say your clearance is exactly 125, you didn't reabsorb it, you didn't secrete it, whatever got filtered ends up in your urine. And if we say it's more than 125, everything that was in your blood got filtered, ends up in your filtrate, and will leave. And if it's more than 125, other things get secreted. So it's not just when your blood supply, but there's also things that are secreting it that goes in there. Now, we use these secretions, or this clearance level, when we analyze drugs. For example, just over-the-counter drugs. We're going to put on there 2 common drugs because you hear them on commercials. Aleve and Tylenol. Now, if you hear the commercials, how long is Aleve good for? 12 hours. It's like it's the all-day drug. Tylenol? I guess? It's usually, sometimes 4 hours. I'm like, unless you get like the extreme or the max or whatever it is. Now, when we're looking at 2 different drugs, that's a 12. When we're looking at 2 different drugs, we also want to know what is secreted and what isn't. One of these has a higher clearance than the other one. Now, if you have a higher clearance that means stuff leaves the body. If you have a lower clearance, that means it can get reabsorbed. So if you have a lower clearance level, substances get reabsorbed. Any guess which one has the higher clearance? Tylenol does. It has a higher clearance. Oops. Meaning, it will leave the body, and if it leaves the body in your urine, is it going to work? No, because it's not in your body anymore. A leave has a lower clearance level. So if a leave is in your body, since it has the lower clearance, it means we are trying to reabsorb it back into our body so that it can keep doing its job. And so when we're looking at certain substances, even just talking about over-the-counter drugs, we're looking to see what the clearance level is of certain things. Some are naturally, have a lower number than others, but they get reabsorbed. If you're developing a drug, like a leave, we're like, we need to have something that we can keep reabsorbing to keep that clearance low so that it stays in the body and works longer. Now, some imbalances, aka things that can go wrong. One is if you have what's known as chronic renal disease. It just means your glomerular filtration rate is less than 60 mils per minute. Now, that means you have some type of damage to your glomerulus. You have some type of damage, meaning your step 1 is not going to work very well in making urine. You're not going to be able to filter as much blood, which means you're not going to be able to get rid of as much toxins or other substances out of our body. Now, if your glomerular filtration rate is less than 60 milliliters per minute for 3 months, we say you have renal disease or kidney disease. Usually people that have that are people that have diabetes or hypertension. You have high blood pressure. That blood pressure is going to affect your filtration rate. If we say someone is in renal failure, your glomerular filtration rate is less than 15 milliliters per minute. You cannot filter things out of your blood. That means toxins will start to build up in your body. Now, one of the things they say, it causes uremia. Now, if you break the word down, it means blood in your urine. Now, it doesn't technically have blood in your urine, but you may have substances of broken down blood in your urine, which you normally shouldn't. And because you can't filter and get rid of certain substances, you're going to have ionic and hormonal balances, metabolic abnormalities, toxic molecule accumulations, all because we can't filter. This filtration rate is not happening. It means we're not making any filtrate. We can't get rid of things out of our body. Now, if you're in renal failure, it means, again, you have toxins building up in your body, causing damage. This is when you're going to have to undergo dialysis, or it's called hemodialysis, blood dialysis. Or, and I'm like, usually while you're sitting there, you're on a wait list for a kidney transplant. Sometimes people are just on renal dialysis for years. I was going to say, our one cadaver up there, I showed you his kidneys, bumpy all over. He was he was in complete renal failure and was undergoing dialysis. Now, some characteristics of urine. 1, urine should be clear. You should be able to see through it. If it's slightly cloudy, it may, but does not always. It may indicate a possible urinary tract infection. There are some other foods and things like that that can make it cloudy, but if it's cloudy, it may indicate urinary tract infection. It's usually some shade of yellow. Now, urine is the same reason, urine is yellow for the same reason brown, or feces is brown. It all has to do with the breakdown of blood and the hemoglobin. Like in our feces, we had stercobilin from the breakdown of that hemoglobin that made feces brown. Well, when we break down the hemoglobin, we have another pigment that comes from the breakdown of hemoglobin called urochrome. That always gives it the yellow color. So feces is always brown, and urine is always yellow. Now, if you have an abnormal color, such as if your urine is pink, brown, or a smoky colored, it may be from some type of food you ate, because there are certain foods that can change your urine colors. It may be because of bile pigments, and so there might be something going on with your kidney or your liver. There may be blood in your urine, which that's never good, or certain drugs, and I'm like, will cause your urine to turn color. I have my little fun fact that beets, blackberries, and rhubarb can all turn your urine red or pink. Yay, you guys can try that. So you can change your urine colors. You can also change the slightly different colors too. Your urine should have a slight smell. Not a strong smell when it's fresh urine. However, if it sits somewhere, this is when bacteria start to go in. They start to break down the solutes that are in the urine, and they release ammonia. This what makes urine a really strong smell if it's sitting around. Now, examples of this where you're like, I don't know, I've never noticed. One, if you've ever had a diaper, and I'm like, my kids are finally getting out of that, and I'm like, the diaper after an all night, they've lasted all night, it smells way worse than a fresh diaper. And like, because the urine has been sitting in the diaper for, 8 hours, and I'm like, and it now smells more. Also, where might you urinate that it seems to be really smelly and you try to avoid it? If you're out and about, like porta potties, they smell bad. I'm like, again, urine is sitting in there sometimes months. Now they try to put chemicals in it to try to neutralize the ammonia that's getting released, but depending on the chemicals and how long it sits there, it's not always great. Old urine smells. Fresh urine doesn't smell very much. Now again, your smell may be altered by certain types of drugs. Certain drugs will give it a sweet smell, not just diabetes, or give it very distinct kind of weird smells, or certain vegetables. And guess what certain, I don't want to say vegetable, asparagus, but it's coming up. It's almost asparagus season. I'm going to check today if it's coming up. So asparagus gives your urine also another smell. So certain foods can change your smell. I don't know if I had any other ones. Nope, just random. Your pH. Now, on average, the pH of your urine is slightly acidic. It usually has a pH of 6. However, it can range anywhere from 4.5 to 8. So big range, which means it can be on the acidic side, or it could even be on the alkaline side. But on average, it's right around 6. Some of that depends on what you eat. If you have an acidic diet, which means you eat lots of protein, lots of whole wheat, that will actually make your urine a lower pH. If you have an alkaline diet, if you're more of a vegetarian, or if you've had prolonged vomiting because you're throwing up all that acid in your stomach, or if you've had urinary tract infections, the pH of your urine will go up and become more alkaline. Now, the specific gravity, the fancy way of saying the density of your urine, is somewhere between 1.001 to 1.003. This is kind of going a little bit with that concentrations, those milliosmoles. Does anyone know what the density of water, pure water, is? 0.00000 infinity. Water has a density, pure water, of 1. That's it. The density of your urine is going to be slightly more than that because it's got stuff in it. It's got some type of solutes in it, so it's going to be slightly denser than water. It generally is still going to be plus water because the majority of what's in your urine is water. So there's my 95% of your urine is water. And about 5% of solutes. A lot of the solutes, yes, there'll be some ions. I think that's my next slide. There'll be some ions, but you're going to have a lot of nitrogenous wastes, things that have nitrogen in them. One of them is urea. This comes from breaking down amino acids in food you eat, proteins. Another one is uric acid. This comes from the breakdown of nucleic acids, DNA, the NA of DNA. And then creatinine, which is from the breakdown of creatine phosphate. This is what helps add ATP, that third phosphate when we're making ATP. It's just a high energy molecule, and we can break that down too. All three of these are nitrogen-based molecules, and a lot of them get secreted out in our urine. Some of it, like urea, recycles, but we can still find it in our urine. Other normal solutes, lots of ions. We're going to find sodium, potassium, the phosphate, sulfate, calcium, magnesium, the bicarbonate ion. Lots of these things we're going to find in. Now, there's usually kind of a normal range of how many of these ions we have in our urine. And if you have an abnormally high concentration or even an abnormally low concentration of any of these different compounds, usually means there's something wrong. Or if you have some abnormal components, if you've got blood proteins, you should never have blood or any type of blood in your urine, white blood cells, bile pigments, Or I was going to say, I have another one. I was going to say, oh, that's big ones. And I'm like, it may indicate some other type of disease is happening. Something else is happening to your body. Now, different parts of the urinary system. Some of this you know already. So we've got to make urine. We just made it. Yay. Now we have to transport it, store it, and eliminate it. So we made the urine in our kidneys with all of our nephrons. And then that urine has to leave our kidneys and go to the bladder, and it does that through the ureters. They are a continuation of the renal pelvis. And if I drew it, you know, here's your renal pelvis. There's your ureter. It's just a continuation. It's all connected. It leaves the kidneys, and it goes down to the bladder. Now, it enters the base of the bladder. Not the top of the bladder, but the ureters actually come down and go underneath the bladder. And as the bladder pressure increases, meaning you're getting more and more urine in there, as that pressure increases, the ureters will close. Kind of like what happens in your heart. As the blood pressure increases, valves close to prevent backflow of blood. Same thing. As the pressure in your bladder increases, we've got valves at the end of our ureters to prevent backflow of urine upwards. Again, it's a one-directional flow out. Now, the ureters have 3 layers, instead of 4, going from the inside and out. They still have a mucosal layer made up of transitional epithelium. Our ureters can stretch as they're transporting urine. We have a muscularis layer that, again, I was going to say it's going to do muscle contractions, peristalsis, to push the urine down and out. And then we have our outer adventitial layer, that's there for more of for protection. Now, things that can happen in our kidneys. One, you can have, it's the official word for renal calculi, which is the official word for a kidney stone. Has anyone had a kidney stone before? No one in here? Yay for you guys. Kidney stones, and I'm like, a lot of times kidney stones will accumulate in the renal pelvis region. It's usually from crystallized calcium, magnesium, or uric acid salts. And so it's crystals. You've got these big chunky crystals that will hang out in there. Now, if you get enough of them, or if they're large enough, they will block the ureter, which means any of the urine that kidney is creating, it can't leave the kidney. It's going to be very painful. Lots and lots of pressure on your kidney. You're going to be in a lot of pain. Now, reasons, things that trigger the chance of you increasing your chance of getting a kidney stone. Bacterial infections can increase your chance. Urine retention. If you have too much calcium in your blood. Everyone's like, yes, you should have lots of calcium, drink lots of calcium, eat lots of calcium. But, you can always, too much of anything is bad. Same thing with calcium. If the pH of your urine is too high as well, it can trigger the formation of kidney stones. Treatment to get rid of it, it's called shockwave lithotripsy. They literally, your kidneys are back here. They, through your skin, will actually do shock waves and try to shock the kidneys apart. And so they break the kidneys up. Now, they break them up, but what's going to still have to happen to them? They still have to go through. They still have to travel through the ureters, into the bladder, and then out the urethra. Now, when you shatter a stone, are they going to be nice, smooth things? Nope. And so as your ureters are pressing down on them, trying to move them out and out through the urethra, it's generally very painful. It can actually cause scrapes and bleeding. People are in a lot of pain. I've never had one, but I had one roommate that had one. Now, your bladder, main function of your bladder, just store. It's just a storage area for urine. We're making it, but you can't always get rid of it right away, so we store it in our bladder. It's found, I was going to say, on the pelvic floor, the bottom of our whole pelvic region. I was going to say right behind the pubic symphysis. Males, they have a prostate gland right below the bladder. Females do not have the prostate gland. Females, it's anterior to the vagina and right in front of the uterus. And so it's kind of sitting right in front of both. Now, as the uterus gets bigger during pregnancy, it will sit actually on top of the bladder, causing what? Got to pee all the time. Now, the fact is also people that are pregnant have more blood flowing through their body, more filtration, more urine's getting made, and the babies, that I was going to say that uterus sits on top of it. It's just nonstop. They got to urinate all the time. Looking at the bladder, there are 3 openings. We call it a trigon. At the bottom part of the bladder here, the ureters coming in, they come down and they release their urine into the bottom. Again, people always think it drops in from the top. It doesn't. It comes out underneath, and here are the ureter openings. Then you have a urethra leaving the bladder, and so the fact that you have 3 holes, we call it a trigon. It's this little triangular area just where you have the 3 different openings. Things are going in, things are going out. The only thing really interesting about it, except there's 3 holes there, if you have a bladder infection, usually it's going to be some type of inflammation and infection right in that area, right where those 3 openings are. Now, the bladder, the layers of your bladder wall. 1, the mucosal layer still has that transitional epithelium. It can still stretch, quite large. It, instead of having 2 layers of muscle tissue, has 3 layers of muscle tissue. It has an extra layer called a detrusor muscle. It's this thick, muscular layer. It's still smooth muscle. You still can't control it, but this extra muscle helps contract the bladder to try to push urine out when you're ready to urinate. And then the outside, we still have that fibrous adventitia. We just have an extra layer of muscle in our bladder. Now, when your bladder's empty, it collapses and you get rugae to appear. Where else do we see that? And the stomach. And I'm like, same basic thing. I'm like, your stomach can expand really large, made of smooth muscle, and when it's empty, you get rugae, you get all these folds. Same basic thing happens with your bladder. Now, when it starts to fill up, it starts to, yes, it will get wider, but it generally starts to get higher and starts to rise upwards when filling. Now, when full, your bladder holds approximately 500 milliliters. I don't have a 500 milliliter. How much is in your water bottle? I'm always curious. Doesn't say? Milliliters?
It's about 800 milliliters.
What's that one? 700? Less than that. That one's 500? Kind of looks like a urinish color. Kind of looks like a little urine. It's about that much. Your bladder can hold about that much. And I'm like, usually that's the point when it's holding that much, you're like, oh, it's stretching enough that you feel like you have the urge to urinate. If necessary, it can hold twice that. How much is yours? Oh, it doesn't say liters. Yeah. 1 liter, it can hold this much. This is a lot. You are going to be feeling it. And I'm like, it's going to be a little painful. But if necessary, you can hold up to that much. Now, if over-distended, if you start to get to that liter or larger, your bladder can burst. Rare that would ever happen because you would be in so much pain before that happened. And I'm like, that you would urinate yourself before you would allow that to happen. Usually the only time that ever would happen is if you have some type of blockage where the urine physically can't leave. Now, so if there's an enlarged prostate, urine physically cannot leave the bladder, that may actually happen. Now, the urethra, to get it out of the body, is just a muscular tube that drains the urinary bladder. Now, it's lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelium, or the mucosal lining. However, there is a little bit of differences. It's mostly pseudostratified columnar epithelium. The urethra, near the top of the urethra, you have transitional epithelium, which is kind of a continuation from the bladder. At the bottom of the urethra, you have stratified squamous near the urethral opening. Why stratified squamous? Why do we have stratified squamous tissue? Where do we find stratified squamous tissue? Our skin, esophagus. It resists abrasion. So if you have to wipe. And so you have stratified squamous epithelium at the end of that urethral opening. And so it resists abrasion when you're wiping. We also find 2 sphincters in our urethra. There's an internal sphincter and an external sphincter. So our internal sphincter, I'm like, is the inside one. It's up close near the bladder. Now, this internal sphincter, the muscle here is a smooth muscle. It's involuntary. We have no control over it. The external urethral sphincter is found on the outside, hence its name, the outside of the urethra. This is made up of skeletal muscle and is voluntary, meaning we have control over it, hopefully. Now, the urethra in a female is about 3 to 4 centimeters. I was going to say inch and a half-ish, and I'm like, not very big. It's found, or I was going to say, I'm like, I have a picture, I'm like, the urethra, and like runs right parallel to where the vagina is. They're right parallel, they're actually attached to each other through a membrane. And the orifice then is right in front of the vagina. So you've got the 2 openings right there. In lab, we looked at it. There's I'm going to say the urethral opening and then the vaginal opening right next to each other. The male urethra, a little bit different. One, it's a lot longer because it has to run through the entire penis. And because of the different things it runs through, it's not just bladder and out. Because of what it runs through, we've got those 3 different regions that we looked at in lab. There's the prostatic urethra that runs through the prostate gland. There's the membranous urethra, also called the intermediate part of the urethra. Membranous urethra shorter, that just passes through that. It's a urogenital diaphragm. It's the membrane tissue at the bottom of our pelvic region. And then there's the penile urethra, also called spongy urethra, because it goes through spongy tissue. And I'm like, that goes all the way out to the end of the penis. And then you have your external urethral orifice, the hole at the end, the opening at the end. So 3 regions in the males. Here was my picture. So you've got your prostatic urethra going through the prostate, membranous urethra through this membrane, and the spongy or the penile urethra running through the actual penis itself. Now, micturition is the name for urinating. So if you're like, wow, I really need to go to the bathroom, be like, I really need to, I was going to say, micturition is kicking in. I was going to say, you're not micturating. And I'm like, but micturition is the actual act of voiding or urinating. And there are 3 things that have to happen that allows you to urinate. 1, you have to contract the detrusor muscle. That's that thick muscle in your bladder. So your bladder needs to squeeze. That's controlled by your autonomic nervous system. Then, the internal urethral sphincter has to open. This is the one right at the base of your bladder, at the very top of the urethra. It has to relax and open, controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Then, we have to open that external urethral sphincter. It's controlled by the somatic nervous system. Which one of the 3 can you control? This one. The somatic means the skeletal muscle, the things that you can control. And so 3 things have to happen when you urinate, and some that you don't even know it's happening. Your bladder is contracting, the muscle is. Your internal urethral sphincter opens, and then you have that conscious control over that external urethral sphincter to relax and open that particular muscle. Now, most of all of this, as we said already, is reflexive. We don't have control over it except that last part, that external urethral sphincter. So we call it reflexive urination, which in an infant, that's all you have is reflexive urination, because they don't have control over that last step yet. Now, filling and that stretching, that distension of the bladder is what's going to trigger all of this to happen. And so when your bladder stretches, it will send information to the sacral region of our spinal cord. And again, it's only going to the spinal cord and back down. That spinal cord will say, let's contract our bladder, the detrusor muscle. Let's open that internal sphincter. And it will try, but we usually have control over it. And I'm like, we'll try to relax that external urinary sphincter. Now, the part of the brain that controls that external urinary sphincter is the pons. And so we call it the pontine control center. It's the pons that controls that external urinary sphincter. Now, the part of the pons that controls that external sphincter doesn't develop until around the age of 2 or 3, which is when you generally do what with children? Potty train them. Until then, they have no control over that external urinary sphincter to try to hold it tight when they can't urinate and to relax it when they actually are on a potty. And I'm like, they don't have control. They can't say contract and relax. And so it's not until this develops that you can potty train. I was going to say, this is just showing the different steps. When your bladder stretches, you have receptors that are like, oh, we're filling. Goes to the sacral region. The sacral region will be like, let's contract this, relax these, urinate. However, yes, if your pons is developed, we can sit there and we can control that external urinary sphincter. Now, if you notice, there's also some information going all the way up to the cerebrum. This controls higher level thinking of, one, you have control over that external urinary sphincter, and the cerebrum is also controlling, okay, so I have to use the bathroom, and you start to think about it. You're like, all right, I've got 20 minutes, 19 minutes now to the end of class. Can I hold it? You know, and you think about it, and you have that conscious thought of controlling that external urinary sphincter. Now, some things that can happen then is incontinence. Means you can't hold it. And I'm like, so you're going to urinate when you don't want to urinate. Usually it's from some type of weakened pelvic muscles. And I'm like, that the muscles, and I'm like, we might be able to control these external urinary sphincter, but the muscle on either side, on the floor of your pelvis, and I'm like, it's weak. So even if you squeeze the external urinary sphincter, everything else is kind of loose and stretched, and you might not be able to hold it all in. Now there's two types of incontinence. The first one is the most common. It's called stress incontinence. If you have any type of increase in any of your abdominal area, any type of pressure increase in your abdominal area, it may cause urine to leak out, that you can't consciously hold that external urinary sphincter. Now, things that may cause an increase in abdominal pressure: sneezing, coughing, laughing. You've probably all heard the, oh my God, I laughed so hard, I peed a little. Stress incontinence. And I'm like, too much pressure in that abdominal area, and you couldn't keep that external urinary sphincter closed tight enough. And you peed a little. Overflow, that's the more common. Overflow incontinence happens when your bladder fills too much that it starts to leak out. This is rare. This usually only happens for people that have some type of nervous system damage, that they can't even feel that their bladder is that full and it starts to leak out. This, more common. Now, things that can also increase the chances of having stress incontinence: aging increases the chance of stress incontinence. And giving birth. The fact that everything stretches, it stretches that pelvic floor muscle as well. And I'm like, and it takes a while to get it back to normal. So you can have a higher chance of, that stress incontinence. Your urinary retention. One, I'm like, this is the opposite. Instead of, too much urine leaking when you don't want it to, the opposite is you can't urinate. So the bladder is unable to expel the urine. Happens after certain types of anesthesia because you don't have control. You can't, okay, let's relax that external urinary sphincter. And I'm like, there's a lot of things that just messages aren't getting sent. It can also happen that the prostate gland in males enlarges because that prostatic urethra goes right through it. And I'm like, it may actually pinch off that prostatic urethra. Treatment is put in a catheter. That catheter will get up into the bladder and drain the urine from the bladder. Another imbalance, and I'm like, some of these are, like, you're born with them, they're congenital. One is called a horseshoe kidney. Instead of having two kidneys, one on either side, they fuse together. Two kidneys fuse into one big, huge horseshoe-shaped kidney. Luckily, generally asymptomatic. It's still going to filter, it's still going to make urine. Most people don't even know they have it. But it's something I'm like, it's genetic, and so you have a higher chance of having it. A lot of times you don't always have that many problems. Things that can happen in males, and I'm like, that's more common. And I'm like, after birth, and I'm like, males that are born, instead of having the urethral opening at the tip of the penis, the urethral opening is at the bottom of the penis. And so I'm like, instead of at the tip, it's just found at the bottom. It's called hypospadias. I'm like, it's that urinary upper is below the penis itself. They usually wait a year till the baby's old enough, and they surgically correct it and extend it out. more common. Another, my third, and I'm like, is polycystic kidney disease, also genetic based. Normal kidney. Polycystic, meaning you have lots and lots of cysts all over your kidney. Again, normal kidney, cystic kidney. Your kidney will enlarge, just looking at the size difference, because the kidney is still trying to filter the blood. It is still trying to make the urine, so it has to grow even larger, and the cysts are filling that in as well. It is genetic. It's a genetic-based disorder. Now, it is a recessive disorder, and so if you have just one, so if one of your parents is a carrier and you get one recessive gene, you can develop into this. If both of your parents are carriers and you get both recessive genes, most infants don't make it past the first year. And I'm like, this is the full kidney disease, and I'm like, and they can't always do a kidney transplant to fix it. So it all has to do, it's genetic, some type of protein that makes it so these cysts form all over your kidney. Then some developmental aspects. Kidneys start making urine by the 3rd month. So if you are pregnant, that baby is peeing inside of you by the 3rd month. Everyone's like, that's so gross. Well, they're just drinking amniotic fluid and then peeing out pretty much amniotic fluid. But their kidneys are they're already starting to filter blood and make urine by the 3rd month. Now, what ends up happening, I'm like, this is week 7, so this is earlier than that. You have something called a cloaca. I don't even have it on here. It's kind of like this, that will actually divide. And I'm like, it will divide into what will become the bladder, what will become the rectum, and I'm like, and what will become the urogenital sinus. Then I'm like, that you're going to have part of, depending male or female, you're going to have the vagina, you're going to have the vas deferens, you're going to have something else running along there as well. So by week 7, you're already starting to develop some of these urinary organs. Some other developmental aspects. In infants, frequent micturition, aka they urinate all the time. Mostly it's because they have really small bladders. I'm like, they drink all the time. Everything they eat is really their drinking. And so they just have lots and lots of urine, and it's usually very dilute. It's less concentrated urine. They urinate all the time. Now, incontinence is normal in infants because they can't control that external urinary sphincter. Again, and I'm like, the pons hasn't developed yet. As we start to get older, I was going to say that's kind of not out of my place. And I'm like, as we start to get older, we can start to have more problems. Generally, infants don't have a lot of urinary tract infections. That doesn't mean they can. As you start to get older, middle school and older, we start to have urinary tract infections. E. coli is the top thing that causes urinary tract infections. Other things that can cause damage to your kidneys is untreated streptococcal infection. If you had strep throat and you never had it treated, that particular bacteria can actually damage your kidneys. And I'm like, with ongoing inflammation. Sexually transmitted diseases could also inflame your urinary tract and lead to more urinary tract infections. I think I had one more. And I'm like, most abnormal, as we get older, most elderly people have abnormal kidneys, tissue-wise, that's histology. A lot of that, their kidneys start to shrink. The nephrons get smaller in size and less of them, and the tubules are less efficient at reabsorption and secretion. Everything starts to go down. Your glomerular filtration rate is half of that of a young adult by the age 80. It means we're filtering only about half. And like by the time you hit 80, you're only filtering about half of your blood. Possibly part of that is from hardening of the arteries that are bringing blood to the kidneys. I'm like, it all works together. Also, as you get older, your bladder shrinks. You have loss of bladder tone, which can lead to nocturia. Any guess what that is? Urinating at night and incontinence. Your bladder gets smaller, which instead of holding 500 milliliters, it goes down and holds only about 250 milliliters. So about half the size. So if you think of how many times you have to urinate through a day, as you get older, that number can double. And because they have less control over their bladder, as well as their external urinary sphincter, it can lead to urinating at night and incontinence. And so what do you hear advertised for elderly all the time? Depends. And I'm like, just in case. And I'm like, it's not like they target old people. It's a natural thing. Everything kind of just goes down. All right, my last review questions. Pull out your colored note cards. I don't have too many. Some of this is from last time too. So the first question is, why is glucose in the urine an indicator of diabetes mellitus? So why would you have glucose in your urine? Now, reason you would have glucose in your urine is the pink. I'm like, it's true, they can't regulate their glucose, which means you will have too much glucose in your blood, but an increased glucose in your blood, and I'm like, should still be able to get reabsorbed back, unless there's so much that all the transport carriers are full, they can't reabsorb anymore, and it ends up in your urine. It's long, I know. Why do high levels of potassium stimulate aldosterone secretion? It's one of the last slides we went over last time. The orange. 1, it stimulates the sodium-potassium pump. It will reabsorb sodium. Sodium will leave. Yes, water will follow. But it causes the secretion of potassium ions. So aldosterone does that. We have the secretion of potassium ions. Which of the following processes in urine formation is important for regulating blood pH? The pink. Biggest reason, if you are too acidic, you can secrete hydrogen ions. If you are too alkaline, you can secrete bicarbonate ions. So we can just get rid of things to regulate your pH. Drinking too much alcohol results in a headache the next day. Why? It is green. It inhibits the antidiuretic hormone, or it inhibits the anti-P. So what's actually causing you to have the headache? Dehydration. How does the antidiuretic hormone contribute to the formation of concentrated urine? How does that hormone work? How does it make it so you're anti-P? It's the Y. The antidiuretic hormone increases the permeability of the collecting duct to water because it inserts aquaporins, water holes, which means water will leave, it will get reabsorbed, it will not end up in your urine, and you don't pee. You just add more aquaporins. We have lots of aquaporins here, but really none over here unless the antidiuretic hormone says, let's put some in, reabsorb water. Which of the following constitutes the largest solute component of urine? Out of these four, which one are we going to see the most of in our urine? It is the yellow. Urea is the biggest. It's one of those nitrogenous things. A lot of it gets recycled, but a lot of it ends up in our urine. The process of voiding the bladder, aka emptying the bladder, is called what? I was going to say, a lot of you grabbed it right away. Yes, it's the pink. It's the Micturition. What's the functional difference between a male urethra and a female urethra? Function-wise is orange. The male urethra is shared with the reproductive system as well. And so semen travels through it as well as urine. And my last question, which of the following is not a change that occurs with old age? So all of these happen as you get older except it is the green. Nocturia doesn't decrease. And I'm like, it increases. Your chance of urinating at night increases as you get older.